Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to talk about the safety application of wearable technologies. I am lucky enough to be joined by some of my fantastic colleagues today who are truly leaders in this field. So I'm really excited to have this discussion and talk about the use of wearable technologies. I have some questions for our discussion today to really guide the conversation. But I invite all of you in the audience to jot down any questions that you may have for the panelists. We will have time at the end to answer any of your questions. Before I get started in talking with our panelists, I just wanted to set the scene a little bit for why we're talking about the safety application of wearable devices and why we feel this is so important. Work to Zero at the National Safety Council is focused on helping employers adopt safety technologies to push us towards the goal of eliminating serious injuries and fatalities in the workplace. Our goal of zero is really important because we think that every worker deserves to come home safely. And technology we see as really being the way that we're going to reach that goal. Safety improvements have come a long ways over the past several decades. If you've ever seen that iconic picture of the iron workers sitting on the beam suspended high above the city with zero safety gear, today we have advancements in cranes and lifts and fall protection because technology has rapidly evolved over the past decade. And we've seen that, in our personal lives with our cell phones and with our entertainment devices like drones and virtual reality, augmented reality, Fitbits, Apple Watches. Those same technologies that are so prevalent in our personal lives haven't fully made its way into our workplace. And that is what we see as being a huge gap. So I'm really excited to talk to our panelists today about these wearable devices and really what the future of the workplace could look like and how we could reach that goal of zero. So our panelists today are going to share with us some of their knowledge and their expertise and their insight into the use of wearable technologies in their workplace for addressing some of their most significant risks, such as fatigue impairment, worker vehicle strikes, effectiveness with workplace training. There's really a wealth of information on this panel. So I'm going to kick us off here with our first question to really set the scene and give our panelists the opportunity to talk a bit about what they have been using in their workplace. So my question for our panelists to start is, what wearable technologies are you using in the workplace? And Aamer, I'm going to point it to you to kick us off to respond to this first question.
Thank you, Emily. So excited to be here, and a great opportunity to share what we have been doing at AES. So yes, like you said, wearables is something we have been using since many years. Different kind of wearable that we are using. We are from the electric utility sector, so we make sure we minimize exposure to electricity, and for that purpose, just to name, so when we talk about electricity, so the EMF, electromotive force, so we make sure we have those badges, monitors on our people to monitor that exposure. And then you talk about remote working, people working alone, so man down system, which can identify when a person is non-responsive or a person is on the floor, so that notifies the control center. Then talking more on that, body cams, and we'll be talking more about body cams as we go into the discussion. So having body cams on our linemen in our transmission and distribution businesses. So, and this was one of the projects that we did in El Salvador, where we have our T&D operations. So we mounted body cams on our linemen, to see what impact does it have on individual when you're being washed, and afterwards when you watch yourself from the training perspective. So that was a project that we did in collaboration with Harvard Business School. So that's something. Then environmental monitoring devices, which monitor the environment in which people are in. And again, during the course of the discussion, we will be discussing how it has to be in one ecosystem. So, so those are the key things we are using. Many other things, and probably, hand it back to you, and let's hear from others as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Aamer. And, it's really interesting. A few of these that you brought up are aligned with some of our initial work to zero research. We wanted to identify what were the most hazardous situations in which workers were dying. And we also asked our mature safety organizations what technology solutions do they feel are most relevant to mitigating those top risks. And, you mentioned lone worker monitoring, and that's something that came up over and over again in our research as being one of the most reliable technologies for reducing fatalities in the workplace. So I'm excited to hear more about what AES is doing in this area. Cathy, do you want to talk a little bit about what you all are working on?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Emily. I really appreciate having the opportunity to join this panel and tell you a little bit about what we've been doing at Dow. Certainly, we're on that journey of digital transformation, like many other companies. And we've been looking at health and safety as well from a prioritization perspective, similar to what you're talking about with safety critical operations and what can we do to get to that next level of breakthrough in our safety performance. Some of the technologies that we've looked at have fallen into the arena of ergonomics. One of those examples would be exoskeleton technology, trying to augment a human's natural capability by taking advantage of a wearable that is portable. And there's certainly some advantages for the diverse workforce that we have and the variety of tasks that we conduct to implement that sort of technology. Also in the ergonomics arena, we've looked at other types of wearables that serve more as a posture coach while also providing us some predictive analytics. The advantage of looking at that type of technology is twofold. One is that it can impact behavior and learning. It can serve as an awareness tool when you receive haptic feedback when you're engaged in an at-risk posture. And then from the perspective of the dashboard side of that kind of technology, it can help us identify risks that we didn't realize exist in our operation and serve more as a leading indicator for us to identify shifts or tasks or specific areas where we need to be further focusing our efforts. Kind of going down that line of that concept of predictive analytics, we've also looked at thermal stress as a hazard. We do have a lot of operations outdoors. We in the US have a lot of operations in the Gulf Coast region where heat and humidity can be a massive concern in the summer months, which can last for about 6 months in this region of the country. Physiological monitoring in real time helps provide, again, some additional awareness to the worker of their risk level as an individual because we understand variability does exist. And again, from the dashboard perspective, it can help us identify somebody who's approaching an at-risk position before they succumb to the effects of something like a heat exhaustion or a heat stroke event. And then finally, the other category I wanted to mention of technology that we're exploring is fatigue. We know when we start talking about safety critical operations and round-the-clock operations and shift work, we have that potential exposure and we want to manage fatigue just like we manage our other safety risks. Technology can provide an additional layer of protection and help us identify again using some of these analytics where we might have some at-risk shift designs or individuals who are more susceptible to the effects of fatigue. I hope this gives you a little bit of a flavor of the things that we're looking at, and I look forward to some continued conversation with this panel.
Yeah, thank you, Cathy. That's a really great overview that you all are working on as well. From the ergo perspective, I feel like right now with so many, especially office workers working at home, I know I'm sitting at a dining room table. I feel like there's an increased issue with ergonomics right now. So that's kind of on top of mind for a lot of people. And then obviously from the fatigue perspective, impairment is a huge topic area for the National Safety Council. So it's really exciting to hear that you all have been working on that. And I know that's been something that you've been working on for quite a long time. So I'm excited to hear more about that. Gregory, do you want to tell us a bit about what Boeing is doing on safety wearables?
Yes, thank you, Emily. And again, like everybody else, I appreciate the time that you've given us to kind of talk about what we've been doing in our manufacturing processes. And like Cathy, we've also been going down that exoskeleton road. looking at ways that we can incorporate some of our active and postural support systems, for legs, back, and upper body to try to help find ways to mitigate some of our potential overhead risk issues, some where we have some excessive bending, and really just in kind of a gap, really, in order for us to at least fill that in short term so that we can start looking at ways that we can address these from a long-term engineering standpoint. I have been doing quite a bit of work recently with augmented reality head-mounted displays, finding ways to not only increase the capabilities for our mechanics to be able to better perform their work, but also how do we use the systems themselves in order to identify safety potential hazards or risks within our manufacturing environment. So, as well as providing potentially brake software. So think of it as kind of like an ergo program that helps prevent or alert the mechanic to potential awkward postures, for the development of musculoskeletal disorders. Been using virtual reality in quite a few different types of ways. For example, we've been looking at how can we use virtual reality as a training modality to enhance not only production processes, but also to use it to illustrate potential pinch hazards or head strikes while the mechanic is learning how to do an installation process, for example. Been using virtual reality for a lot of design reviews, so especially for new programs, being able to integrate safety safety processes into the build rather than have to worry about them after we've already begun production. So being able to monitor and capture, address, for instance, reach, anthropometric differences for access, and even other assessments. Recently, with the advent of COVID and our pandemic, we've been looking at a lot of different ways to use smart watches or sensors, not only to look at biologic transfer, but also how do we do contact tracing, as well as putting up that 6-foot perimeter for sensing. I've also been looking at smartwatches and sensors for avoidance for potential pedestrian and vehicle interactions. So not only are we monitoring the flow of materials and transport within our facilities, but also how does it interact with the human elements as well. Lastly, there's been some continued work looking at confined space, so atmospheric monitoring, and then going back to what you had mentioned earlier, that lone worker monitoring as well. So just a few things that we've been kind of exploring across the facility, across our enterprise.
Great, thank you, Gregory. And Greg was kind enough to join us at the Work to Zero Summit this past February and demonstrated one of the exoskeletons that Boeing is using, and he was very popular with his cool technology that he was demonstrating. So thank you for that. But I wanted to touch on a little bit before we go to our next question. Greg, you mentioned technologies for mitigating COVID risk. And actually, Work to Zero just got done doing a series of webinars on this very topic of how we can use technologies for mitigating COVID risk. And one of the most interesting webinars in that series for me was on the use of proximity sensors for physical and social distancing. And I just found it really interesting because this is a technology that is already deployed in a good percentage of workplaces that's used mainly to mitigate those, near strikes, so pedestrian on vehicle or on equipment. But with just a small tweak in the use of that already deployed technology, they're now able to assist in physical distancing between employees, but also contact tracing. So two really cool new uses of a technology, a wearable technology that was already deployed out in the field. So I thought that was just a really interesting use of that technology. I wanted to share that. So my next question for my panelists is about the returns that you've seen on your use of these wearable technologies, the benefits that you've seen, and if you're able to kind of maybe give us a little bit of backstory on, you know, why you explored this type of technology, whether it was because there was a certain risk or a certain issue that you were trying to overcome. But I'd love to hear more about the benefits of the wearable technology that you've seen, whether it's from a health and safety perspective, productivity perspective, employee morale even, which I've heard as of recently. And Cathy, why don't we go ahead and get started with you?
Yeah, Emily, that's a really good question. And it's one that comes up a lot when we're talking about return on investment. One thing that we learned early on in our journey in the innovation space is a lot of times people see something shiny and new and cool, and they just want us to try it out and use it. We have a very structured methodology at Dow of how we approach innovation, and we have a 4-phase process essentially that starts with chartering our project and really defining the value case, which is then followed by some bench testing before we even take the technology into the field for a further proof of concept or piloting process. And the whole intent, of course, of piloting would be to validate the value case. To your point, there's a variety of values that can be derived from technology. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not a silver bullet solution to whatever problem we're trying to solve. So the first aspect is to recognize and understand that it provides an additional layer of protection to address an existing risk that we've recognized, whether it's safety, health, environment, compliance. We recognize it's one layer of protection. With that, we construct our value case, and it could be a productivity measure that we're able to recognize. It could be a reduction of risk. The way that we quantify risk is through our exposure assessment process. We can assess safety and health hazards using a very methodical process that generates for us something that we call a priority rating. And that rating ranges from 1 to 5. As a company, our strategy is to focus on the top priorities first. And where we see that technology could help us potentially bump down a level in that risk rating, we try to start by focusing on those. I think the exoskeleton technology is a very good example of that. We bench tested, we piloted, and we recognized that we actually could achieve the risk reduction that we were projecting to move us out of one category of health risk to a lower category. And once we learned and recognized that, we moved to a deployment or implementation strategy. That being said, we like to use the terminology of fail fast because we have had a number of value cases that were constructed, and upon field testing, a lot of learnings that helped us to recognize that we weren't going to derive that benefit. Talking about employee morale, that's a really good example. We evaluate that wearability and usability piece. So even if a technology might be able to deliver a certain result that we're looking to measure, if it is not accepted by our user population, then it's not a technology worth pursuing. For us, it's really essential that we have the user population in mind, that we approach this from a human-centered approach, and we understand where something isn't going to meet our needs from that wearability perspective, in which case we could either look at an alternative to that technology, or we, as I mentioned, fail fast and we move on to the next project.
Thank you for sharing that, Cathy. And I know that you have talked to some of the Work to Zero team about Dow's process of innovation. And I was really excited to learn more about that. And we're hoping to kind of bring those lessons to other companies, because I think there is a lot of learnings there for others. How about Greg? Do you want to tell us a bit about the benefits that you've seen from your wearable technologies?
Sure, absolutely. And I would echo that a lot of what Cathy says. You know, we're kind of in alignment with the same way that Dow is looking at a lot of that benefit structure and making sure that, you know, the worker is definitely, you know, centric in making those decisions as we move forward. I mean, all too often we find a lot of solutions that are sitting in the corner just collecting dust. And, you know, why do we want to go down that path again? But AR has been a very key element in seeing a lot of benefits for a lot of our work processes. I think an example of that has been one of our products that we delivered for the Air Force, which was the tanker program. Initially, the wiring in that particular product is extremely complex, and more so probably than any of our commercial products that we have in that scale. And we were seeing a significant amount of rework associated with that wiring installation because of its complexity. If you can imagine looking at a schematic diagram as a mechanic or an electrician who has to go in and install this, and the ream of paper is laid out 8.5 by 11 sheet and about 25 feet long. So you can imagine that you just really don't have space to go laying out that kind of electrical wiring diagram, schematic, in order to be able to see what it is and how and where I need to put that product. So typically what they would do is they'd fold it into somewhat of a manageable size, but as you can imagine, it's only looking at a very small piece. And so unfortunately, there were some quality defects associated with that. Well, with the application for augmented reality, the mechanic was actually able to see the beginning and end points fairly clearly where they had to do line out the wiring. So it was extremely much easier for them in order to do that. So we saw some decrease in cognitive load. The short-term memory is much more reduced. They don't have to overload. There's been some significant improvements in productivity for that, almost a 50% improvement in productivity. And we saw somewhere of about a 98% first pass quality, which was up from about that 50% mark as well. So, huge increases benefit-wise right off the bat. Exoskeleton, in some of those situations that we've deployed it, we've been seeing similar industry gains in our productivity from about 25 to 30% improvements. We've also been looking at how we can use AR and actually seen evidence of its support that we can improve our mechanics or our workers improve situational awareness while they're in that work area. So a lot of times they're not able to pay attention to the area that they're in as well as we would like, and so we've actually been able to improve that, as well as seeing some injury reductions overall, especially with the exoskeleton and with some of our other AR and wearable systems. So quite a bit across the board.
Fantastic. Thank you, Greg. And Aamer, do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the benefits that you've seen from your wearable technologies?
Yeah, sure. I would love to. And as Cathy said, and I would actually echo on her words, human-centric. So I think that's the key here, to being human-centric, and that's where we start in AES, to make sure that we minimize human exposure. Elimination is the key, and with starting from safety, which is the key. Safety of our people and our contractors, and what we have seen actually, you start with safety, but then you start seeing positive results outflowing in different directions, so it's in productivity, it's in finance, morale, inclusion, so employees are more engaged over there. So like when we talk about the project I mentioned earlier in El Salvador, so the productivity, because again we were focusing on safety of individual, but we found out during the study that the productivity increased. The time period that the person is taking to do an activity decreased. So that was from 65 minutes as a median to 56 minutes. So an activity which was being done earlier in 65 minutes came down to 56, and then the safety score, the average safety score increased as well. So people doing better with good safety score in a less amount of time. So that's something that we saw as a benefit. Then we talk about other is like say drones. We have been using drones, and honestly that's where we started off, but probably I would say 7 years back, and the drones were the first technology we brought in, and we had some issues. We had a fatality in one of our facility in South America. It was during a tree trimming operation. Induction was an issue, and this unfortunately our one of our contractor got this induction current, and we said, no, we need to eliminate this. And we brought in tree trimming drones over there. So these were like not just simple cutting drones. So a drone would fly up and do a job, branch cutting drones, and the other hand would pick the branch and bring it down to the operators, and a working drone rather than just inspection drones. And that's where slowly and gradually we moved on into a transmission and distribution, different things. And with this, our drone program has really developed, and we have been able to actually do more than like 4,000 hours of drone flying, and we've been able to save something like, I would say, 65,000 reduction in hazardous exposure hours. So that's an incredible save, minimizing the exposure of people, eliminating their exposure in activities such as, diving, dam diving, deep diving, aerial monitoring next to energized lines. And I talked about tree trimming, inspections inside the boilers. And then with this comes the financial saving as well. So we have been able to save something like, more than 11-12 million dollars as a savings. So these are the things we were able to really quantify, and then of course the employee morale and the inclusion. So that's something which you cannot actually quantify, because again, safety is done from heart, and when people start thinking and start believing that the technology is being brought in to save us, to make our job more safe and secure, so that transmits and reflects in each and every job and in each and every section, so that's something that really helped us out. So I would say benefits in multiple directions.
Yeah, thank you, Aamer. And Aamer was also nice enough to join us at our Work to Zero Summit this past February to show off some of their drone technology, which was also really fascinating. So thank you for that, Aamer. Yeah, you mentioned the employee morale, and that is something that I have found particularly interesting lately. I was talking to somebody about the use of virtual reality for training, and they just kept going on and on about how their employees are actually excited for safety training now because they're using this cool new technology that has been shown to be more effective than the classroom-based training. But above and beyond that, they're actually excited to be sitting through a training, right? So I find that to be a really cool perk of that technology. So thank you all for sharing some of the benefits of your wearable technology and your technology program. My next question is, how do you prioritize the technology that you adopt? And when Work to Zero was first getting launched, I said this earlier, but one of the first things that we did was investigate where are workers dying and what technologies are available to help mitigate that risk. And we actually identified 100 different types of technologies that are available to help with safety, which is an overwhelming number of technologies. So for people in your positions, I always am interested to learn, how do I prioritize what tech you adopt? So I think, Greg, you have not started us off on a question yet, so why don't you go ahead?
Sure, Emily, thank you. So a lot of the things we look at are probably two different categories. We want to go through and evaluate, where are our current injuries occurring from, and what's the cause of that? What is the root cause? And when we were looking at exoskeleton systems, we were trying to determine what is it we need to prioritize, what is it we need to go after first. And looking at our injury data, shoulders was not one of our highest injuries, but was one of the most costliest. And so we looked at what was the cause for those majority of shoulder injuries across our company, and looked to see how we could pair that up with current technologies that would help address and alleviate some of that shoulder injuries, which was specifically being impacted by overhead work. And so that's how we kind of started looking at it. Another area is our high hazard or life critical areas, which can include things like confined space, fall protection or falling from heights, as well as automation, and I can't think. We have about 7 or 8 of them, and so those and pedestrian vehicle interactions is one of those as well. So those are what we're looking at, saying these are the ones that are typically worst outcomes. And so what kind of technologies can we make sure and implement that are going to help prevent, further prevent any of these types of accidents occurring? And then looking at what are the technologies that we could use, which is how we started looking at a lot of our sensors and looking at movement of materials and personnel within the factory to kind of help mitigate and reduce or eliminate, actually, I should say, some of those potentially high life critical issues. And it's been quite successful so far in trying to address those particular areas. And that's kind of pretty much how we prioritize what do we want to look for first, and then finding the technologies that marry up with that.
Great, thank you, Greg. Aamer, do you want to tell us about how you prioritize what technologies you are adopting?
Yeah, I would just add, what Greg just said. So SIF, the SIF study. So that's the key, understanding, what kind of activities can be eliminated, are those high risk activities, and then, based on the statistical analysis, really understanding what had been the key high risk areas or the areas where we had been having injuries or potential serious injuries, so non-injury events. So, and then making sure that whatever we are bringing, is it able to take care of that particular situation. So that's one. And then the short term and the long term impacts as well. So doing an analysis, using tools and techniques to really understand what's low hanging fruit that you can easily capture and make an impact, and then what needs further time, and if it needs further time, what can you really do to mitigate the harmful impact until that time. So those are the things we make sure when we're bringing in technology, we do those kind of analysis, because you see what happens is there's so much available out in the market. So the key is to really filter out, really understand what's needed for you, what's doable for you, what makes sense for you, and then what's the bandwidth, so what's achievable and what's not achievable. That's the key as well. Like I said, so many things available, because people will bring back to you so many things from the market. Very excited. Yeah, this looks good. That looks good. Yeah, yes, okay, that looks good. It's fine, but is it the right technology that we are looking forward to? And then again, through the panel, happy to discuss further. Like what kind of criteria do we identify to really understand why the technology will work for us. Again, being on a global level, operating from Hawaii all the way to Vietnam, so how can you have that implemented globally? So that's also one of the key criteria, that we need to have language, because we operate in different languages in different parts of the world. Is it doable in that language? And then different markets from the cyber perspective, that's also the key right now. And really understanding from that perspective, because when you're going digital, you need to have those cybersecurity barriers in place. So those are the key parameters, factors, that we keep in mind when we are, bringing in something and we are doing our prioritization metrics.
Yeah, thank you, Aamer. And one of the criteria you mentioned was how to implement this globally, and that's what I've seen as one of the barriers to adopting technology programs like this, is that it always starts off in a pilot phase, but I think sometimes employers struggle to scale that upward. So I'm glad that's one thing that is on your mind, from the get-go when you're adopting a technology program. Cathy, do you want to share a bit about this from Dow's perspective?
A lot of good feedback here, from the whole panel. So I don't want to be redundant with anything that was already stated. I will say from a strategic perspective at Dow, we operate, when we start talking about breakthroughs in performance and how do we achieve that from a health and safety perspective, we govern ourselves with a technology plan. We look at various initiatives and prioritize going with stakeholders in that process, our sites and our regions and our businesses, to figure out what will get us to that next level. And part of it is looking at injuries. Part of it's looking at some leading indicators of performance and trying to project what's going to happen in the next 10 years, really taking a forward-thinking view. And really, technology just kind of couples with that process. Again, going with that theme of recognizing that innovation doesn't occur in a vacuum. And a lot of times what we're doing is partnering with the rest of some sort of management system. I think the fatigue technology I mentioned is a really good example where we have an entire project at Dow focused on implementation of a fatigue risk management system, because we recognize there's a lot of factors to fatigue. They're interrelated, and we have to address it through a comprehensive program. Technology is one piece of that overall program. And I will say, as we look at other technologies, a lot of them also, same thing with ergonomics, it fits into a health reduction effort on that priority scale that I mentioned earlier. Same thing with thermal stress. There's a project related to that that hits other aspects of thermal stress. And so really we take the view of technology being that additional layer that we can basically bolt on to an existing effort, so it's not something that's occurring by itself. And it also is occurring with that engagement from our businesses and our sites, partnering with our function, our health and safety as a function, to be able to deliver some results and taking into account all those great things that the other panelists mentioned as well.
Fantastic, thank you. And one of the kind of reoccurring themes I hear from our panelists today are that when they're looking to adopt a technology, it is to mitigate an existing risk that they see, whether that is current injuries or some high risk jobs that are being done. And I'm so glad to hear that, because when we first started Work to Zero, one of our main talking points was that we didn't want employers to have what we called shiny object syndrome. We don't want them to go out and adopt drone programs because drones are really cool and we want to play with drones in the workplace, right? We want to look at where are the injuries occurring, where are the fatalities occurring, and what technologies are relevant for that. So it's really great to hear from you all. I wanted to add in here, some of our early Work to Zero research. We interviewed some of our more mature safety organizations that have implemented safety technologies for a while, a decade or more. And we asked them the same questions about their how they prioritize tech. And we had very similar responses. The number one response was the effectiveness of the technology, the relevance to their top hazardous situations. They were also concerned about the ease of use for the workforce. If a technology is too difficult, your workers probably aren't going to use it or use it well. And then the fourth one they talked about was lifetime cost of use of that technology. So that is in our most recent Work to Zero report, if anybody wants to get more information on that. So my next question for you all, and Cathy, you actually touched on this a little bit, was, how to adopt the technology so that there's an integration into the workplace. It's not just an isolated adoption of this technology, but how do you adopt it in a way that it, penetrates and really adheres to the culture? So do you want to start off, since you just finished kind of speaking on that? So the question specifically is, how do you integrate the tech into your workplace?
I'll give an example. That's probably the best way. And there's kind of a fresh one I have going back to the exoskeleton technology. I think each one is probably unique in terms of deployment and adoption. What we learned in our piloting process was that we did have some use case scenarios where the technology worked really well, and then we had other learnings where we recognized it doesn't work that well. And essentially our conclusion out of the piloting activities that we conducted was that there were applications for this, but not really across the entire company sort of applications. And we wanted to make sure our sites and businesses were aware of where there was benefit and where there was not. what we did is we developed essentially an exoskeleton playbook that is available as what I would call a pull implementation system through our global ergonomics standard. And we have all this cradle to grave information from there to help people through a flow charting process identify whether they have a use case or not, how to go through a testing process and a validation process, thinking about safety and ergonomics, thinking about health, and then some information on vendors, how to go through the whole purchasing process if all of that is successful. So basically just A to Z, anybody can grab it and pull it, because we do get a lot of questions because it's shiny and interesting. However, there is a push approach to our system as well, where we have those, as I mentioned, those priority health risks, and we have a tracking system for those. So we're taking that existing system and following up with those businesses to ask them, have you identified a solution for the problem you're trying to solve? And could exoskeleton technology be a fit for what you're trying to achieve? And that's the push approach, where we want to knock down those high priority health risks, and we're going to be proactive from a strategic perspective on that. Now, some systems we look at are more of just an entire push approach. Some are totally a pull approach, where we want people to make that decision, especially when we start talking about health wearables. And that's probably a whole topic in and of itself, so I will pause with that.
Thank you, Cathy. Greg, do you want to talk a little bit about the integration of technology into Boeing?
Yeah, sure. And like Cathy as well, we also went through for exoskeletons and created that playbook, provided a lot of that detailed information, for for groups who are looking to find ways to integrate exoskeleton systems into their production, as well as also doing some of that push. But I did want to point out that for us too, as well, has been one of the key aspects from an integration standpoint is making sure to identify upfront those stakeholders and what their responsibilities would be for integration, and what would it be for sustainment. We've been finding that in certain areas we have some difficulty with that continual sustainment, because if you think about it, well, at least within our enterprise, we do have people who transition from one job to the next, or they may rotate from one job that they're maybe doing overhead work to one area that they're no longer doing that. So what happens to that piece of equipment that we were using before to prevent that overhead work? So how does the next mechanic understand that, oh, hey, I have the opportunity to use this system, and where do I go and how do I go about getting it done? So it's that continual sustainment process that we find that is probably one of the largest areas that we have, or we had struggles with, and so I think getting buy-in support from those upfront stakeholders, whether there be operations, training, tooling, whatever your process may be, and getting their buy-in up front definitely helps sustain the piece.
Thank you, Greg. And Aamer, do you want to touch on this one?
Yeah, for sure. Probably I'll, kind of wrap it up, because the panelists have said, really good things here. Yeah. So the key thing is, I would say the MOC, the management of change, is the key. So that's something we really focus on when we are bringing in a new technology. Really understanding who are the end users, who will be really using it. Inclusion, making sure they really understand they're part of the decision-making process as well. So that's really important, because the end user, needs to really, own what is upcoming. So it's not just like a postman ring your bell and hand it over to them and say thank you and you move on. So that's not what we want to do. So that's something we eliminate. We make sure, and then the scalability. From one market to the other, the way we try to do is we try to roll it out in phases, pilot projects, to see implement in different markets, in different languages. So we have that test run up front, and then you do the scaling upwards, slowly and gradually. So again, rolling it across the globe is at the same time, so it may not be a really nice idea, so that's something we we try to do. And the other thing, one of the key approach, and I touched about it earlier as well from the cybersecurity digital. So we make sure our digital team, is part of our process and is part of the group early on, making sure they really understand what's in there, the architecture from the IT perspective, because bringing in all these technologies and integration is the key here, the ecosystem, so it's not you bring in one system, say for example, you have a man down system, and if man down is a standalone system, it's not communicating with other systems that you have. Say for example, you have a oxygen monitoring badge that a worker is wearing, and if it's just a standalone, so okay, it will give a kind of a signal warning to that individual, but then that has to be linked with your system installed in your control room, that has to be linked with your permit to work system documentation, your online monitoring. So all these things, so that is also something we guys are now very actively working, how to integrate this and bring it under one ecosystem, that all the technologies that you have are actually interconnected, speaking and talking to each other. So say for example, like your SEM system is something which is monitoring your emission, how does it give feedback to your the HSC information management system. Likewise, the safety walks which are being done. So how do they interact with the other systems available, the proximity sensors that you have installed? So how is it giving feedback to the other systems? So all systems talking and speaking to each other. Say for example, the induction system that you have for your contractors. So how is it making sure that those who are getting into the confined spaces are trained enough? So all these kind of mobile application, handheld devices, so because QR codings, bar codings are so easy to do these days. So with those codings, how do you make sure everything is integrated? So these are the things we are working, and of course it's a journey, it's a learning experience, and that's what we all are here actually sharing what we have, and of course it's a, like I said, learning experience as well. So I'm really looking forward to the other sessions here. I see the list here, so great sessions, great topics, so I'm really looking forward to the other discussions as well. Emily?
Yes, thank you. Aamer, Cathy, Greg, thank you so much for spending time with me today. It's fantastic to hear all of the lessons you've learned and to share with others. So I really appreciate your time and your expertise. At this point, we can take questions from our audience.